joining us. Welcome to everyone from around the world. I'm Michelle Stirling, Communications Manager for Friends of Science Society, and you're joining us tonight for Donna Laframboise, Climate Activism, Undermining Free Choice, Free Speech, and Free Thought. Now, this was actually scheduled as our 17th annual event, and it was supposed to be at the Red and White Club in Calgary, where we usually have a buffet dinner and spend the evening with the two speakers that we normally have. But of course, that was canceled by the pandemic. So we moved it online and we split it into two parts. Tonight, you'll be participating in part one, which is Donna Laframboise, Climate Activism, Undermining Free Speech, Free Thought, and Free Choice. And then in January, we'll be presenting Dr. Roy Spencer on January the 19th, 2021 at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, same kind of setup. And he will be talking about the main reasons why there's no climate emergency. So I hope that you will join us for that event as well. Now, for this evening's event, Donna Laframboise is a journalist and also a past vice president of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And she's been deeply involved in the climate issue for many, many years. She runs a blog, which is called bigpicnews.com. So I hope that you'll subscribe and follow her work because she brings you all the insights on climate activism that you never hear about in mainstream media. That said, I wanted to say that as you're watching her pre-recorded presentation, which will roll in just a minute, you might want to have some questions to submit to Donna to discuss in our live Q&A after the presentation. So just if you don't know where that is, just scroll down on your watch screen and you'll see there's a submit questions form. Now, we do have a team that will be correlating these questions and putting the ones that are similar together so that we're not asking the same thing over and over. Those selected pre-submitted questions will be asked of Donna at the end of this presentation. So with no more ado, let us present you Donna Laframboise, Climate Activism, Undermining Freedoms like Free Thought, Free Speech, and Free Choice. Let's roll that video.
Hello, I'm delighted to be taking part in this Friends of Science event. Originally, I was going to deliver this talk in a room full of hundreds of people, chatting together, shaking hands, enjoying a lovely meal. But we've all had to adapt in recent months, and so today we're going to give this alternative format a whirl. At the end of this presentation, I'll invite you to drop by my blog, where you'll be able to take another look at my slides and find extensive hyperlinks to all of the material I'll be discussing. Today's topic is climate activism, undermining free speech, free thought, and free choice. Generally speaking, I think activism is a great idea. If you've informed yourself in a careful, conscientious manner and you feel strongly about a topic, by all means, go for it. Make your case to those around you. Try to win people over to your way of thinking. Yay for the marketplace of ideas. But something quite different has been going on with climate change. For many years now, climate activists have insisted that their point of view is the only one that is acceptable, the only one that is respectable, the only one that deserves to be heard. These people have systematically discouraged genuine exchanges of opinion. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's step back 13 years to 2007. Ellen Goodman was then a Pulitzer Prize-winning American journalist who wrote a twice-weekly column that was published not only in the Boston Globe, but in 400 other American newspapers. So a UN climate report gets published that year, and while writing about it, Goodman says this: let's just say that global warming deniers are now on a par with Holocaust deniers. Now, when someone compares you to a Holocaust denier, are they seeking common ground, or are they browbeating you into silence? One approach is democratic, the other is not. As far as Goodman was concerned, individuals who hold alternative climate opinions are not sincere, they're not honestly mistaken, rather, they are morally defective. If you say someone is on a par with a Holocaust denier, you're really saying that they're evil. In Rome in 2009, Gro Brundtland, a former Prime Minister of Norway, who was then serving as UN Special Envoy on Climate Change, delivered a speech to a forestry audience. In that speech, she declared, "It is irresponsible, reckless, and deeply immoral to question the seriousness of the situation we are in." A climate activist at the top of the UN hierarchy, declaring that thinking for yourself is not permitted. Sit down and be quiet. Accept the UN's word as gospel, or the UN will say you are the problem. You are immoral. In other words, you're evil. Over at the New York Times, no less a personage than a Nobel laureate, economist Paul Krugman, has used his regular column there to accuse climate skeptics of a form of treason against the planet. On another occasion, he has said that climate skeptics deserve to be punished in the afterlife for their almost inconceivable sin. On yet another occasion, he has called climate skeptics depraved. So we've got Goodman, and we've got Brundtland, and we've got Krugman. These are prominent, celebrated, influential people with enormous public platforms. In 2009, Kevin Rudd, who was then the Australian Prime Minister, joined the chorus by delivering a speech that described climate skeptics as dangerous radicals, reckless gamblers who were prepared to destroy our children's future. There's a climate problem, all right. A climate of intolerance, a climate in which dissent is not permitted. The people responsible for this appalling state of affairs are prime ministers, UN officials, Nobel laureates, Pulitzer Prize winners. These people are the establishment. And this is a really, really important point. Climate activism may at one time have been about grassroots grannies funding themselves with bake sales, trying desperately to get someone to listen to them. But that is not the situation today. For many, many years, climate activism has been embraced by the most prominent people imaginable. It is the establishment that won't stop talking about climate change. Successful people, influential people, affluent people who frankly live very different lives from most of us. The ordinary Joes and the ordinary Janes, we're focused on paying the bills this month, on affording hockey equipment and dance lessons, on getting our parents to chemo treatments. The establishment likes to talk about the importance of democracy. It says things like, politician X is a threat to democracy. But the establishment has zero interest in what ordinary people think about climate change. None of this is legitimate activism. If you are trying to control what gets said in the public square, you are an anti-democratic dickhead. If you're trying to browbeat your fellow citizens into keeping their questions and their doubts to themselves, you're a bully. Speaking of bullies, let's take a look at Greenpeace, which likes to cast itself as David versus Goliath. Whose side has Greenpeace been on? Well, it too is now part of the establishment. For the longest time, the Greenpeace USA website explicitly repudiated free speech. Liars are not entitled to free speech, said Greenpeace. Climate skeptics are liars. They spew misinformation and propaganda. Therefore, they have no right to be heard. That argument is, of course, entirely bogus. Lies and spin come at us from all directions, every day of the week. They're a fact of life, not a reason to shut down debate. If you can be silenced the minute someone calls you a liar, then free speech doesn't exist. Everyone can shut down everyone else simply by playing the liar card. The question of who's being honest and who is pushing propaganda can't actually be determined until everyone has had a chance to present their case. There is, in fact, a serious and compelling argument that Greenpeace is itself a giant propaganda machine. If free speech does not apply to propagandists, then Greenpeace should set the example and fold its tent immediately. So how about climate activist David Suzuki? Which side is he on? Has he been championing free speech? I'm afraid not. Here's the headline of an article he wrote back in 2012. Deny deniers their right to deny. Suzuki thinks democratically elected politicians who hold non-conformist climate opinions, and such politicians are a rare breed these days, should be thrown in jail. He said so in 2008, in 2013, and again in 2016. Let us remember that Amnesty International defines a prisoner of conscience as someone who has been jailed because of their nonviolent political beliefs. Suzuki wants to turn politicians with whom he disagrees into prisoners of conscience. In 2015, a group of academics sent a letter to the US President and the US Attorney General urging those powerful people to launch a RICO investigation into entities that express non-conformist climate views. We're talking businesses, think tanks, and community organizations. RICO stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations. When the RICO Act was passed in 1970, its purpose was to help the authorities convict mafia bosses of murders they had ordered but had not personally committed. Someone found guilty under the RICO Act can be sent to prison for 20 years. In America, in 2015, 20 professors at publicly funded universities, more members of the establishment, wanted people with whom they disagree to be subjected to an organized crime investigation. And what about UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization? It publishes a magazine 4 times a year. Last fall, climate was the theme. Climate crimes must be brought to justice, declared the title of one of those articles. Climate denial has increased the risk of catastrophic global change. Therefore, economic and political leaders must be held accountable. Now let us remember that laws are an expression of a particular community's values. In some countries, adultery is a criminal matter that ends in death by stoning. That's not how we do things here in Canada. But the author of that article, a British professor of political theory, another member of the establishment, thinks that international criminal law should be expanded so that politicians who spurn the UN's climate agenda within their own country's borders can be hauled before the International Criminal Court. Like David Suzuki, this professor wants to turn democratically elected politicians into prisoners of conscience. Speaking of how we do things here in Canada, in January, the Winnipeg Free Press newspaper published an editorial headlined, "Time to Silence Voices of Denial." This was not the personal opinion of a single individual, but the consensus view of that newspaper's editorial board. Senior journalists whose own jobs rely on free speech, declaring that multiple climate perspectives have no place in the current conversation. I contacted the Free Press and was advised by the Perspectives editor, a man named Brad Oswald, that he stood fully behind that editorial. Now please understand, the job of a perspectives editor is to be intellectually adventurous. Oswald's job is to publish a variety of points of view so readers can make up their own minds. But newspapers now employ perspective editors who proudly declare that unless you agree with the establishment, you have no right to participate in the conversation. While ordinary people have been busy living their lives and minding their own business, the forces of censorship and coercion have grown. Anti-democratic climate activists are everywhere, in all levels of government. They're thick on the ground in universities. They're in charge of newspapers and television stations. They can also be found in courtrooms around the world. Employed by hundreds of green NGOs, environmental lawyers are using all of their brainpower and employing every legal trick they can think of. They are searching for new ways to impose their climate views on the rest of us. Now, climate activists, when they stomp all over free speech, and when they intimidate people into silence, they are in fact committing two distinct offenses. First, they're shutting down a fellow citizen who has as much right to participate in the conversation as they do. Second, they're interfering with the broader community's right to hear what everyone has to say, to evaluate firsthand a range of competing perspectives. Dominated as it is by establishment voices, the climate conversation is narrow and circular rather than substantive and sophisticated, which means we are all being shortchanged. We used to be very clear that censorship was a bad idea, that it was associated with fascism and Stalinism. Democracies, we said, were different. During the Cold War, the American Library Association took a bold stand against censorship, pointing out that democracies depend on an informed public. The public, it said, needs full access to conflicting ideas, controversial points of view, and minority opinions. To this day, the librarians champion free thought by asserting that everyone has the right to access information from all points of view, so that they may explore any and all sides of a question, a cause, or a movement. Climate activists have strayed a long way from that philosophy. Rather than promoting intellectuals' freedom, they've spent years insisting there's nothing to talk about, that the debate is over. Al Gore has famously been uttering those precise words since at least 2006. Let me say this loud and clear. A debate is not over simply because one side says so. We all know this. Shall we watch the Barbie video or the Frozen video? If the kids can't agree, there needs to be negotiation. There needs to be compromise. The kid who declares, "Debate's over, we're doing what I want," is a nasty little brat. When someone tells you the climate debate is over, especially if you've never even had the opportunity to witness an actual debate on this topic, they're saying, in effect, "Don't worry, you can trust us." Now remember, these activists believe we need to turn our lives inside out. According to these people, we're supposed to be engaging in rapid, far-reaching transitions connected to energy, transportation, food production, land use, urban planning, building design, and industrial processes of all kinds. Everything we humans do requires affordable, reliable energy. We need gasoline to run our car. We need natural gas to heat our homes. We need electricity to refrigerate our food and to power the internet and our smartphone. Pretty much everything we do produces greenhouse gases, including exhaling. Activists say we must reduce these gases. not steadily and incrementally as technology improves, which is something we're really very good at, but rapidly. They say we have to interfere everywhere. We have to change everything. We have to meddle in every corner of society. Now, to me, this is absurd. Governments can't even balance their own budgets. Yet climate activists want governments to oversee the redesign of virtually everything. To make things climate friendly, we're going to break everything all at once, in a rush. What could possibly go wrong? Well, we could take a look at Germany. That country has tried very hard to become carbon neutral. It has spent obscene amounts of money on solar power and wind power. The result is disastrous. Germany is way behind schedule in terms of its emissions cuts. The price of electricity has risen sharply. If you are a retired person struggling to pay your bill 10 years ago, your life has gotten worse, not better. Moreover, the once robust German electricity grid is now unstable. Something that used to work well has been redesigned. A ton of money has been spent to make things worse. But all of that is a bit of a digression. Getting back on topic, when climate activists say the debate is over, they're actually saying, trust us. But no one with a spine or a brain or the smallest bit of self-respect finds that argument persuasive. We all know there's more than one side to every story. In a court of law, we don't just listen to the prosecutor, we listen to the defense lawyer too. It's perfectly reasonable to suspect that the climate activists in our universities, our bureaucracies, and our governments don't know what they're doing much of the time. No one understands everything perfectly. No one sees the entire big picture. People who sincerely believe we're facing a climate crisis need to stop scolding us and engage in dialogue instead. They need to persuade the rest of us. They need to invite criticism and address that criticism. They need to convince us that their math makes sense, that their logic is sound. The more important an issue is to humanity, the more crucial it becomes that we think about it carefully and deliberately. It's important to challenge conventional wisdom. It's important to understand the pros and cons of a range of options. Declaring that the debate is over is not nearly good enough. Where freedom of thought is concerned, climate activists behave like the nasty little brat I mentioned earlier. Let me tell you about two people. The first is Bjorn Lomborg. He's a cute gay guy from Denmark who is eternally cheerful and professional. Lomborg is a sophisticated thinker. In interviews, speeches, articles, and in his best-selling books, he repeatedly acknowledges, yes, climate change is a problem. But he says there are smart ways to respond and there are dumb ways. He's the adult in the room, arguing that much of what governments are currently doing is a waste of money. In 2015, Lomborg's think tank, the Copenhagen Consensus, was about to open a sister research center at the University of Western Australia. The purpose of that center was to evaluate foreign aid projects in economically deprived parts of the world. From a cost-benefit analysis, which projects provide the most bang for the buck? What does a successful story look like? What approaches sound good on paper, but fail miserably in the real world? In Lomborg's words, quote, working with more than 100 economists, including 7 Nobel laureates, we have produced research that measures the benefits of a wide range of policies, such as fighting malaria, reducing malnutrition, cutting air pollution, improving education, and fighting climate change. Now, this new research center would have been called Australia Consensus. it would have provided a forum in which lots of people, including climate activists, could participate in grown-up conversations about how best to rank competing priorities. After all, climate spending, which represents a huge share of foreign aid these days, doesn't do a thing for the children who will die of malaria today, tomorrow, and next week. Let me just repeat, Lomborg is not a climate skeptic, but his opinions are nuanced rather than crude, and he is realistic rather than dogmatic. But climate activists are so self-righteous and so intolerant, they see little difference between Lomborg and full-blown climate skeptics. Australia consensus was scrapped. $4 million in funding was returned to the federal government. In the words of one university official, "I have stated many times that this is not a center to study climate change and that Lomborg would not be involved in its day-to-day operations." Nevertheless, the university pulled the plug due to the scale of the strong and passionate emotional reaction. A group of vocal opponents on campus and beyond shut down the Centre for Free Thought. According to the leader of the Australian Greens Party, funding that research centre was an insult to every climate scientist in Australia. The student organisation acknowledged that while Lomborg doesn't refute climate change itself, many students nevertheless objected to him being anywhere near the project. Let me tell you what everyone at that university learned that year. Disagree with climate activists and you may find yourself chased right off campus. You don't need to question climate change per se. All you need do is stray beyond the very narrow band of acceptable climate opinion. A couple months later, a newspaper reported that staff and students at another Australian university had warned of an angry backlash if Lomborg were allowed to set up a research centre there. The project has now been totally abandoned. Freedom of thought, anyone? The second person I want to tell you about is a Canadian zoologist named Susan Crockford. Last year, this accomplished scientist and fabulous role model for young women was excommunicated from the academic community. Crockford is a world-renowned expert in animal bone identification. She is routinely hired by biologists and archaeologists to help identify the remains of mammals, birds, and fish. She has helped catalog museum collections and has assisted police with forensic analyses. But Crockford has committed an unpardonable sin in the eyes of the Church of Climate Change. Calmly and persistently, she has declared that polar bears are not in trouble. On her blog, polarbearscience.com, and in a collection of books, Crockford says these bears are actually thriving. Whatever might happen in the future, they are currently at no risk of extinction. Crockford doesn't dispute climate change per se. As a zoologist, she just thinks the public shouldn't be misled about how climate change is affecting wildlife. This small rebellion has made her a huge target. While she received support in the past from Canada's University of Victoria, free thought is no longer protected at that institution. For the better part of a decade, this university's Speakers Bureau arranged for Crockford to deliver an unpaid lecture to elementary and high school students titled Polar Bears, Outstanding Survivors of Climate Change. There is every indication she was a popular speaker, but in 2017, things changed. Since her affiliation was with the anthropology department, she was advised that the chair of that department needed to confirm she was an appropriate person to represent the university. This same anthropology department had awarded Crockford her PhD 13 years earlier. But while serving as chair, Anne Stahl put a stop to Crockford's Speakers Bureau talks. According to Stahl, these talks had generated concern among parents regarding balance. This concern had been shared with various levels of the university. Balance. It's a fine word, but there is no suggestion on the Speakers Bureau's website that presentation must be balanced. The same university that barred Crockford from talking about polar bears had no problem with another professor lecturing students as young as kindergarten age about revolution and climate change. It seems balance only becomes an issue when climate activists complain about you and your colleagues need to invent an excuse to shut you up. An unspecified number of complaints lodged by who knows who and who knows when, about which Crockford was never told at the time, and voila, she's dropped from the Speakers Bureau. Then at its first opportunity, the university banishes her altogether. The position of adjunct professor is reviewed every 3 years. In 2016, a committee voted unanimously in her favor. But 2019 was a different story. After 15 years on staff, Crockford was advised the committee had voted not to renew their relationship. No reasons were provided. In Crockford's words, this was an academic hanging without a trial conducted behind closed doors. During the years in which she spoke to elementary school students, she was startled by the fact that most teachers routinely believed polar bears were on the brink of extinction. Crockford thinks the public has a right to know that according to official estimates, tens of thousands of these bears are alive and well. These are the kinds of people being sacrificed on the altar of climate change. What conclusions do we suppose other academics draw when they hear such stories? How much does their own background fear of stepping out of line increase? And what exactly is going on in higher education these days? What are we as taxpayers funding? Are young people learning to think critically and independently? Because if the opposite is true, if universities have become places where students and staff must parrot climate dogma, then it's definitely time to defund the universities. Slowly but surely, the walls have been closing in around us. The list of things you can say without climate activists trying to destroy your career and your reputation grows ever shorter. Houston, we really do have a problem. Because after you've shut down free speech and free thought, the next step is to shut down free choice. And we're already farther along that path than many of us realize. The CEO of Starbucks says that when consumers order coffee, his company intends to push them to choose non-dairy options. Supposedly, the carbon footprint is smaller. But humans have no history of consuming highly processed almond milk. Not everyone's digestive system reacts well. Never mind that a coffee shop is supposed to give you what you want, not nag you about your carbon footprint. I used to be a frequent Starbucks customer. I don't go there anymore. In Germany and Australia, climate activists are demanding meat be taxed. Activists used to worry about whether families could afford nutritious food. Now they want to arbitrarily and artificially raise the price of sausages as a solution to climate change. Whatever happened to letting people decide for themselves? Those concerned about the carbon footprint of meat don't have to eat it. Those who think human brains need animal protein can choose differently. Financially penalizing people who make the wrong choice is one of the ways activists undermine free choice. A 2019 report wants to redesign human dietary guidelines so that they're more climate-friendly. What this is really about is marginalizing traditional food, such as eggs, milk, cheese, and meat, and replacing it with often highly processed, plant-based products. Here's a grid from that report. It talks plainly about restricting and eliminating choice. It talks about removing, withdrawing, and banning inappropriate food. It discusses turning certain foods into pariahs. The UN and others are now part of this plant-based food movement. There is growing concern among nutritionists that this movement is prioritizing climate change over human well-being. Malnutrition hasn't yet been stamped out here on planet Earth. Many people still eat meat rarely because they can't afford it. Their children's brains may therefore not be developing in an optimal manner. But the establishment is more worried about the climate than about malnutrition. Climate activists don't just want to tell us what to eat, they want to control how we cook it. Gas stoves, prized by professional chefs and serious home cooks, are now being outlawed because of their contribution to climate change. We need to start noticing something. In many places, city councils have been taken over by climate activists. Rather than filling potholes, collecting garbage, and plowing snow, these people think their real job is fixing the climate. Not by persuading their neighbors, but by using the law to restrict their neighbors' choices. Anyone concerned about the carbon footprint of a gas stove doesn't have to buy one. It is another matter altogether to make it illegal for me to do so. For years, climate activists have been reducing our home heating options. First, they targeted coal, which has the benefit of being inexpensive. But they didn't stop there, because climate activists never stop. They are never satisfied. Whatever we do is never good enough. In an attempt to become carbon neutral, the city of Montreal, which experiences some of the coldest winters on the planet, will force every oil furnace in the city to shut down by 2030. A news article explains that while natural gas would seem to be an obvious substitute, the city intends to ban that as well in 2050. In this regard, the UK is way ahead of Montreal. Natural gas furnaces in new homes are banned in that country beginning 4 years from now. Why did the UK government take such a momentous step? To address the concerns of children protesting about climate change. Now, children are wonderful, but being the least knowledgeable, least experienced segment of our society, they should not be in the driver's seat. So let's take a look at a news story announcing this ban. You'd think climate activists in the UK would be celebrating this significant step. Instead, they're complaining it's not good enough. Greenpeace wants the already planned ban on gasoline-powered automobiles moved up by a decade. It also wants a frequent flyer tax. Meanwhile, Friends of the Earth gripes that the finance minister is fiddling in the margins rather than putting climate change at the heart of the UK's economic strategy. Climate activists are everywhere. They are admirably energetic. Partly because journalists behave largely as their mouthpieces, reporting their assertions extensively and uncritically, climate activists are transforming society. Inch by inch, they are creating a world in which everything gets judged according to the climate impact. The number of children you have, your long-cherished family recipes, your asthma inhaler, your holiday celebrations, your pet food. The direction in which we are headed is not good. Do we really want to live in a country in which the only choices available to us are those approved by the Church of Climate Change, where necessities and frivolities alike are continually being banned or taxed out of existence? Do we want to live in a society in which the religion of climate change is imposed on all of us? To conclude, Climate activists have spent years stomping all over free speech. They've spent years declaring that the debate is over. Via the mainstream media and the universities, they have been snuffing out free thought. Rather than doing the hard work of changing your mind, of persuading you to voluntarily choose option B over option A, climate activists are ramming their choices down your throat. This is profoundly anti-democratic behavior. Thank you for your kind attention. If you'd like to take another look at the slides, or if you're interested in any of the material I've discussed here today, please drop by my blog at bigpicnews.com/more/sources. Friends of Science spent money filming, editing, producing, advertising, and hosting this event. That's why you were charged an admission fee. If things are tense financially right now, no worries at all. But those of you who are in a position to do so, please consider leaving a little something in the tip jar on my blog. May the sun shine upon us all. Ciao for now.
Hi, and welcome back. That was just a great presentation. So Donna will be joining us live from her home in Ontario, but I just wanted to say we did get a few comments that people had a bit of trouble with the bandwidth, and this is our first time out. We apologize for the technical errors that you may have experienced, and you will be able to see a clean run on the recorded version. So let's go now to Donna, who is standing by live in Ontario. Donna, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us with a live Q&A.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, it's great. Now, I was very interested in watching the presentation that most of the people who are so adamant about climate denial and calling people names are not scientists themselves. They're like Grobertland's a politician, and Krugman's an economist, and Goodman is a journalist. Even Suzuki, he's a geneticist, but that's a completely different field. Like, what's going on with all these non-scientists telling us what to think about climate?
Well, this is a topic that encourages people to have very strong opinions and strong emotions. So, and it is a matter that it concerns us all. And I understand. I understand your point. They're not scientists, but the policies
Lost your sound.
are
Lost.
that concern everyone.
So, in light of the fact that you were a former vice president of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, what's the deal with these associations? Like in the United States, the ACLU will, go to court for neo-Nazis' right to protest. But what do they do for climate dissidents? Do they stand up? Do you have any insight on that?
Well, the civil liberties associations here in Canada and in the US, to my knowledge, have not been very supportive. In fairness, I think the explanation for the Canadian situation is this Canadian Civil Liberties Association is a small body. It has a limited budget. It has to pick its battles. And historically, it has concentrated on defending Canadians from government. Um, um, from government undermining our civil liberties. So if a government in Ontario or in Alberta or elsewhere in Canada decided to pass a law making climate skepticism illegal, I would expect the Civil Liberties Association to be right there at our side supporting us. But there has been, there has been no government taking any action against against climate skeptics. So I think that's why it's part of the explanation of why the civil libertarians have not rallied to 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 protect and to promote free speech for climate skeptics.
Well, but that's interesting because in 2015, Eco Justice, that big law outfit, went after us, and they wanted to put us in jail for our billboards, and and fine us. And there are quite a vast network of lawyers who are on this case. Do you want to comment on the legal aspects of?
I'm sorry. I actually don't know much about that issue at all. So I don't think it would be proper for me to say
No, no,
anything
but I mean
without
about
doing it.
the fact that lawyers are really into this whole issue of climate denial and um, all kinds of legal attempts. You mentioned in your presentation there's that lawyers are trying everything they can to take this issue to court. Uh,
Yeah. So green groups right now, we have to understand that green groups, at one point in history, they were small, they didn't have a lot of power, they didn't have a lot of money, and that is just totally not the case now. Green groups are basically a collection of lawyers and
mm,
lobbyists. And so there is this incredible database that has been put together by Columbia Law School, and the internet address is
mm,
climatecasechart.com.
mhm,
Climatecasechart.com. And if you go there, you will find a searchable database that has 1,700 lawsuits relating to climate change. And you will see that the Sierra Club is suing the Mexican government and the Spanish government. You will see that the Center for Biological Diversity is involved with 159 lawsuits right now. And the Natural Resources Defense Council is involved with 52 lawsuits. So much of what climate activists try to do now is through the courts. And there was this incredible story a few years ago about Stockton, California, a city in California where the Sierra Club decided that their official plan was not sufficiently addressing carbon emissions reduction. And so the Sierra Club threatened to sue the city. And instead, the city caved and basically gave over its design of its official plan to the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club dictated what should be in what became part of that city's official plan. So this is a complete sabotage of democracy. It's supposed to be the public elects officials who then make decisions on behalf of the public. And instead, the official plan is being drawn up by the Sierra Club because they don't want to have to spend, you know, thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions suit from the Sierra Club. So lawyers are an incredible part of the climate movement, and it's a very anti-democratic thing that's going on, and it's going on in hundreds of lawsuits.
wow, I don't think the general public is really aware of that. And they're probably also cheering them on, going, yeah, they're going to save the planet. And destroy the economy. Yay. Um, we have some questions coming in here, and I have one from Cameron in Calgary. And he says that at about 11 minutes, you refer to a British professor of political theory who wants to expand international criminal law so that politicians who spurn the UN's climate agenda within their own country's borders can be hauled before the International Criminal Court. What's the name of that professor? That's what Cameron wants to know.
Well, her name is Catriona McKinnon. And if you go online at my website, bigpicnews.com/more/sources, you'll see all my slides, and and there are links underneath every
Oh,
slide. And so you can go read Miss McKinnon's entire essay. I really encourage you to do so. It's an amazingly incoherent argument, and the idea that it was published in a UNESCO magazine is quite stunning. So yeah, her name is Catriona McKinnon. And yeah, she's got some very anti-democratic ideas.
Hmm. Oh, okay. So Jim in Calgary is saying, and now you've eloquently described the threat to freedom of speech imposed by the Church of Climate Change. But what can we as individuals do about this?
Well, I think there are a number of things, and one of them is I mentioned I don't go to Starbucks anymore. I can live without a coffee shop that is trying to nag me about my carbon footprint. I used to be a big fan. I simply don't do it anymore, and that is the reason. So we can make those kinds of choices. I'm hoping that one of the things that my presentation has contributed to is a sense of clarity. I think clarity is very important, and the point that we need to remember whenever we encounter any proposal for anything to do with the climate is that we are dealing with a movement that is anti-democratic. We are dealing with a movement that is trying to shut down free speech and is trying to restrict free choices. And it doesn't matter if they are right about the climate issue, their analysis is right. It doesn't matter if they are right about the policy side of things. This is an anti democratic movement. It is very dangerous to democracy. And people who care about things like free speech cannot support this kind of movement. We need to oppose it, we need to resist it. And so the clarity that this is not a movement that is taking us in a positive direction, quite the opposite, I think is very helpful. And climate skeptics have tried to argue the science. They've tried to argue the policy. Lomborg argues policy brilliantly. He's
Yes.
he's wonderful at it.
Yes.
But the in so far neither of those strategies have been very successful. So I would encourage people to start thinking and to also to start talking just, in a friendly way to those around them. Do you really want to be aligning yourself with a movement that is so anti-democratic? It is not a good thing to be doing that. Even if you agree with them on the science, it is not a good thing to line up with people who want to stomp all over free speech. That's not respectable company. So if we have that clarity, I think it's a good way to argue things, and maybe I'm wrong, but it's another way to approach this issue. And I mentioned in my talk that it's time to defund the universities.
Mhm.
University is supposed to be a place where you send your child to have their mind expanded, to be exposed to a variety of perspectives, to learn how to evaluate different arguments. And right now, universities are some of the most intolerant places in the country.
That's for
And
sure.
so, defunding universities, I think, has two components. One of them is, the provincial government has to start saying to these institutions, if you are not standing up for free speech, we're going to stop giving you money. That you must have policies in place. I think that the provincial government that does that kind of funding should be involved. But also, every university has a fundraising department. And that department, one of the things the people who work there try to do is they try to persuade you to leave them money in your will, a legacy. And so I think it would actually be very interesting and very helpful and useful potentially for ordinary people to call up the fundraising department of universities and say, I'm thinking about writing a new will soon and I have some money and I'd like to come and talk to you about what your free speech policies are.
Mhm.
I want you to tell me whether this university would be tolerant of a climate skeptic giving a talk, and if not, I'm going to leave my money somewhere else. That is something that any ordinary person can do.
Mhm.
is have that conversation with any university.
Okay.
And and
Yeah.
the other thing I think is the same thing with political candidates. Now, as a journalist, I don't belong to a political party, and I've never donated to a political party. I think it's important for me to keep some distance. But my understanding from friends is that if you write a check for $1,000 or $2,000 to a candidate, they actually really notice. And they are prepared to listen to your concerns. It actually doesn't take a lot of money to influence candidates. And again, I think the message to those candidates should be, I don't want you supporting anything that's got to do with the climate, because this is an anti-democratic movement. This is a movement that is destroying democracy. And so I don't want you voting for bike lanes, if that's if what the bike lane if the bike lanes are being financed by federal government climate change money. I don't want you declaring that this small town in Alberta has got a climate emergency, which politicians are doing a lot these days. So my money is contingent on you resisting the climate movement, and I don't care if you believe their analysis. You must resist it because it is an anti-democratic movement.
Wow. Wow. I've never heard it put so well. Thank you. That's fantastic. That gives people lots of practical things to do and quite a bit of food for thought. Um, we have another question here. Warren from Alberta asks, what is the underlying motivation for the widespread curtailment of free speech, which you have so effectively enumerated? Do you think it's a lack of confidence to openly debate, or could it be that the ends justify the means?
Well, I think there are many explanations, and those are two very important ones. I think for some people who are zealots, they are climate activism has kind of become their substitute religion,
Mhm.
and they are they are very focused, and they're very dogmatic, and they're very narrow-minded, and the ends do justify the means for those people. But we have seen from history that when people think the ends justify the means, you end up in some very, very unpleasant places. And I also do think that some climate activists are lazy. I think, the thing about a lot of social movements is they are social events. They are a community, a group of people you hang out with. And so I think many of the people in the climate world are young, and they're idealistic, and they're a little bit naive, and they want villains and heroes, and they want to think of themselves as heroes, so anyone else who disagrees with them must be villains. And we have also a couple generations now of students who have come through university, and rather than being taught that free speech is the bedrock of all of our other freedoms, they have been taught that anything I don't like is hate speech. Um,
That's true.
so and therefore should be silenced. And um, so I think there are a number of explanations, and none of them are very comforting. We should be concerned.
Okay, we have a question here from Paul Schmidt. He's saying, are we planning to more strongly advocate the negative effect of the very tight bureaucratic governance of the IPCC on the ability to attract competent and qualified scientists who are used to having more freedom to do their work, and also the lack of competence and qualifications of their scientists as exposed in your book, The Delinquent Teenager? And has this changed since the book was written? In private industry, we always judge the qualities and reputations of the organization and personnel separately before trusting them with challenging work.
Okay, so I think the question is, have things improved at the IPCC? I think is that
In
if I
terms
if
of
I understand.
competency and qualifications, yes. Has it changed since the
Uh,
book was written?
I don't think it has significantly. The problem with a big organization that has been around for many decades, like the IPCC, is that it has its own culture.
Mhm.
And anyone who has any background in business management knows that it's very difficult to change a culture. And the only way it really happens successfully is if you have a very strong leader who is very involved and makes a Herculean effort
Right.
to change the culture. So there is unfortunately, I don't see much hope for the IPCC. I don't see it ever reforming. My personal hope is it's just going to fade away. But I don't think there is any reason to think that that the that things are going to be better there. That there's going to be any improvement.
Well, yes, I guess also if they did improve, then it might just spoil their game. So why would they? And we have another one here from Randy Stubbings. He's saying, why do you think the mainstream media has bought so heavily and questioningly into the idea of catastrophic human-caused climate change? And is there any hope that they will ever see the light? Are we doomed to follow the horrific Great Reset now being laid out before us?
Well, I don't know about the reset. But the mainstream media, unfortunately, most people who are journalists tend to be left of center,
Mhm.
very much left of center. I am an independent and a moderate, and I have been called a right winger by my own colleagues pretty much all of my life. So most people in newsrooms are left of center. They are, they, they subscribe to fashionable ideas and fashionable politics, and a lot of them are very much climate active, consider themselves climate activists. So you're not going to get, like a neutral, balanced assessment from them, and that's really too bad. And
Mhm.
journalism is not as respected as it once was, and there are some very good reasons for that. And one of them being how journalists have covered climate for decades now. And one of the
Yeah,
things that I talked about in my book was journalists basically regurgitated IPCC press releases for years and years and
yeah.
years, and never bothered to even check if any of this information in the press releases was accurate.
That's true. I mean, when you look at the Toronto Star, they have a stated policy that they will not publish anything that conflicts with the 97% consensus of scientists, and obviously have never done their own due diligence to show that there's no 97% consensus.
Yeah.
Um, we have here from Ken Vanderbergy. What do you think of Peter Ridd's, the Australian scientist who was questioning the notion that climate change is killing the Great Barrier Reef? What do you think of his idea of requiring governments to establish an independent office of science that answers to the Auditor General, because the Auditor General usually understands independent? And the purpose would be to conduct quality assurance that includes testing, checking, and replicating any science, such as climate change claptrap, before it gets adopted as government policy.
I think that's a fabulous idea, and the details can be worked out about who reports to whom, and what the parameters are. But we have a terrible problem, and that's that academics publish all kinds of studies all the time, and those studies usually never get double checked.
Mhm.
They're never replicated, and so governments take a study with that has never been double checked, and they make policy on it. And Peter Ridd is another one of those cases of a person who is being sacrificed on the altar of climate change. He belongs in the category with Susan Crockford and Lomborg, and that in that he tried to get his university to bring up its game, to raise its game, to improve the quality of its research, and he basically lost his job over it, and he went through a couple years of horrible. Horrible struggle with the university, where instead of being treated as a whistleblower, he was treated like a criminal, like
Right.
he was the problem. So, so the idea that we should not be making government policy on the Great Barrier Reef before we have done some due diligence and double checked this research on which we're basing new laws and new regulations, that's a crucial, that is a very, very important proposal.
Yes, well, actually, Roger Pielke Jr. just came out with a paper showing that all of the catastrophic views on climate change are based on very outdated science. And just like there's been mistakes in cancer research where dozens of researchers used the wrong cell, presumably for breast cancer, I think, but it was actually a mouth cell or something like that. Nothing to do with breast cancer. Anyway, and they'd published thousands of papers. Same in climate science, where all these papers have been published, and like you say, they haven't been checked, and they're based on something that's outdated and completely unrelated to reality. Um, so we have here another question from Mr. MJ Gwindon. I hope I pronounced that correctly. How can I respond when a climate alarmist sends me links claiming carbon dioxide alone is causing the 1 degree or so increase in average temperatures since the industrial age started and all the extreme weather events after that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, perhaps it's time to stop, for some people at any rate, stop trying to argue the science and just say, maybe your science is right, but the movement, the climate activist movement, is anti-democratic, and it's
Right.
against free speech, and it is against free choice. And why are you aligning yourself with a movement like that?
That's a very good point. That's a good angle. Robert Lyman writes, no industry stands to lose more from the climate policy measures imposed to date than the oil and gas industry. Why, in your view, have most of the industry's leaders remained silent about the adverse impacts of these measures on their companies, shareholders, and employees? That's a good one.
Well, the my husband many years ago did an MBA, and one of the courses he took was on how to manage the media and how to manage attacks
Hmm.
from outside. And the advice that he was given at the time was, it's your job to run your company. It is not your job to tangle with government, because nothing is going to good is going to come from
Ah,
government from that. Government is much more powerful than you. That you need to um, look after your shareholders and look after your employees, and tangling with government is you can't win because it's much bigger than you. So I that is an approach that makes sense to me.
yeah.
Everyone's got to make their own decisions, but I'm sympathetic, because when you're tangling with government, or you are tangling with green groups, it's asymmetrical warfare.
Yeah.
It is not an even playing field.
Right. Okay, we have here one from Ken Gregory. The Calgary Herald and other newspapers have refused to publish articles and letters that present evidence and climate data showing that the climate is much less sensitive to greenhouse gas emissions than claimed by the United Nations Panel on Climate Change. What can we do to encourage newspapers to publish such articles?
I don't think there's anything you can do. I think maybe it's time to, maybe there needs to be some new newspapers. But these organizations are, as I said, like the IPCC, there is a whole culture there. You are not going to change it. They are moving in the wrong direction. They are losing readers, and they deserve to lose readers, because rather than publishing a wide range of opinions and allowing adults to make up their own mind, they are feeding us all pablum, and
Right.
it's appalling and it's unprofessional. But I don't see them changing. It's too bad, but I'm not sure what the future looks like for news, but newspapers are going down the drain, and they have themselves to blame.
Okay. Paul Johnson asks, how did journalism get so unbalanced on this issue? And I guess in part you answered that there. How can it be fixed?
It's a shame because as a journalist, I want to learn about the world. I'm curious about the world. I want to learn new things.
Mhm.
I don't want to just keep writing the same story over and over again and telling people the same thing that the newspaper up the street has told them, or that the person on the radio has told them. I am astonished that journalists do not have more curiosity about the world out there, that instead they seem to think their job is to feed us all this vision of what how they feel the world should be, rather than telling us what's really going on out there and what the debates are and what ordinary people are thinking.
Marie Mitchell asks, one of the issues with mainstream media is that people at the top are rich moguls who believe in the lie. Would you agree with that statement?
Who believe in the lie?
That they believe
Oh,
in the sort of the catastrophic AGW, I guess, view.
I think that could be true. Yes, the editors are making the decisions about what kind of stories to and what kind of stories to publish. And newspapers these days are kind of vanity projects, because you don't make money, you lose tons of money. Airlines are like that as well. You own an airline, not because you're making money, but because it's high prestige. So
Mm.
yes, I think the owners of many newspapers are, they've swallowed the climate dogma, and they're not curious. They don't actually want to learn new things about the topic. They believe what they believe, and they're not serving the public, and that's why newspapers are dying.
Right. Steve Portlands asks, why is the climate change anti-oil gas energy narrative not being challenged by logical thinkers as a contrived method used to implement rationing of the finite global reserves of these energy sources?
I don't know. We humans are amazing sometimes, and we are capable of incredible things, and then we are incredibly silly. Um, a lot of the time as well. And logic is, as as a journalist, I try to present facts. I try to present logical arguments, and I'm a tiny little journalist with a tiny little voice, and the people who have the massive audiences are not doing what I'm doing. They are presenting a much more simplistic and fashionable and leftist analysis, and it's very discouraging.
Yes, I would say that that's very true of Columbia Journalism Review, which supposedly was the pinnacle of journalism at one point. But now they have this Covering Climate Now, where they have 400 media outlets with an audience of 2 billion people. And their most important interviews are with people like the director of Mad Max, who confirms that, yes, we are witnessing climate change dystopia now, just like in his film, rather than one or two interviews with the people of Clintel, for instance, who are actually scientists rather than film directors. Great as he may be as a film director, he's not a climate scientist. So we have here Great and Tranquilla is asking, are you and many of us aware of the ASH experiment and how it has now been successfully used by mainstream news media to manipulate all to think in a like manner? And Dr. Judith Curry referred to this situation as an error cascade, a scientific term for reaching the wrong conclusions en masse.
I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that, so I probably shouldn't say anything.
Okay.
But the idea of error cascades is very interesting, and you know, we get ideas into our heads, and it takes them to get them out again, and we just go full steam down the railroad track, and yes, it's a problem. It's a problem with again, we're wonderful, and we're also really flawed.
Yes, well, we're humans. So, I mean, that's the beauty and the despair that we do wonderful things, as you say, and we do crazy and sometimes very unproductive things. We have one here. Oh, I forgot to mention earlier on that David Hines said you're welcome in Alberta anytime. So he's very
Thank you.
keen on your work. David Birkby writes, not sure how you deal with the Greta syndrome, where young, educated, altruistic people have taken up the cause with a passion that's mostly based on emotion. These days, with Google, you would think they'd do some fact checking to make sure they hear all sides of the discussion. How do we deal with this next generation? That's a good question.
That is a good question, and I like to be optimistic. I like to tell myself that as these young people get some experience in the real world,
Mhm.
they will find that it doesn't necessarily behave the way they expect. That things aren't necessarily the way the climate movement has described to them. That's not necessarily how the world works. I think once people have children, they get a little more sensible, because they have real issues in the real world to deal with, and I think that I'm a much smarter person than I was when I was 20 years old, and I think that happens to many of us. I think we should be kind to young people, but it doesn't hurt to try to point them in the right direction. And sometimes, um, you know, it takes a while for a seed to germinate, but you can drop some seeds, and a few years later, maybe something that you said to a young person will finally, penetrate and will be the sort of opening a new window for them.
Okay, very good. Henry Engelking writes, why are politicians afraid to listen to both sides of the climate science debate?
Well, I think that's a very, very good question. And I think one of the things we need to understand is that if you are a politician and you vote against the climate movement, there is a big downside. There's a big risk. Greenpeace might be demonstrating outside your home tomorrow.
Right.
Okay, the downside. There is no downside when you go along with the climate train, and that is and Greenpeace and lots of other people have spent decades involving themselves in all kinds of organizations and lobbying all kinds of politicians at all kinds of levels, and they have figured out how to put pressure on people. And there's nothing coming from the other side.
Mhm.
And I think maybe some of those tactics, not in a bad way, but just in a good way. Some of those tactics, maybe people with alternative perspectives need to explore. Just for a moment, if I can tell you, I think about 2012, I was in Scotland to give a speech, and the gentleman who had arranged for that event also arranged for me and a local writer to go in and meet with a couple members of the Scottish Parliament.
Mhm.
And I had never done anything like that before. And I was a little bit uncomfortable because I'm a journalist, I'm not a lobbyist, but I'm visiting from Canada and I have a book. And I went in with this other writer. And these two Scottish MPs spent half an hour or a bit longer with us and were very respectful and listened to our perspective. And at the end, a junior person in the office brought us down in the elevator and back to security, and we left the building. But in the elevator, that young man said to us, "I'm so glad you're here because Greenpeace is here every week talking to our caucus." and and the MPs never hear another point of view. So I'm so glad you're here. Now, perhaps it is time for organizations such as Friends of Science to organize a committee where people regularly go and visit members of the legislature, members of parliament, because Greenpeace is doing it, and is the World Wildlife Fund, and so are lots of other groups, and there is no counterbalancing force.
Oh, yes. I think any of our audience would be astounded if they looked on the Canadian lobbyist registry, and probably same with lobbyist registries around the world. But there are just dozens and dozens of ENGO lobbyists, and they are in and out of ministers' offices and deputy ministers, and every single day of the week. And this is how they get grant money from the government for their good works. And this is how they influence the government. And then quite often, as we've seen recently, they end up actually becoming part of the government. So then it's just like having an office meeting when you next go into lobby, because the guy on the other side of the desk used to be your boss at the NGO. So, yeah, they're thick as thieves, so to speak. I have a couple more questions here. How are you doing time-wise, Donna?
I'm good. We're good.
Okay, good. Well, I have one here from Richard Penner. He's saying, considering that climate change has been going on ever since the Earth was formed, why has it become such a contagious issue at this particular time in our history?
Well, they're one of the arguments is that after the end of the Cold War and after the Berlin Wall fell, there were all sorts of activists who had been very invested in the Cold War politics, who suddenly didn't have a home anymore.
Right.
And so they migrated over to environmental issues because there was lots of money
Right.
there. And you could still tell yourself that you were saving the world and you were making the world a better place. I think that's part of the answer. I think the media is always looking for something that sounds very dramatic.
Right. Big headlines.
So, you know, uh, headlines. But on the other hand, I think it's worth noticing that the overpopulation scare of the late 60s didn't last all that long. The scare about acid rain didn't last that long. Hole in the ozone layer that was going to give us all skin cancer didn't last that long. But climate change has really taken root and us for 25 years now, and it shows no sign of going away. And part of the problem is that now there are people who work on climate change at every level of our government, municipally, provincially, federally. There are a lot of people whose jobs are concerned with climate change, and getting rid of people in the government who have jobs on certain topics. There is now this constituency of people who are going to scream out of their own self-interest if you try to, shut down climate change jobs in government. So we're in a bit of a pickle, but it is interesting that it has taken root, and it is not, it's been a long time. It's had a long run.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, I think also the fact that the financial community is into it, and Joanne Nova did a great video on the other side of climate, on the carbon trading industry, and that's a whole big Pandora's box. But I think that that's one of the main drivers that's sort of unseen to the public eye, because that's going on like in the finance, banking, and industrial sector. But it's big money, and we are talking about simple policies, as you mentioned, bike lanes and things like that, where they seem to make no sense, but somehow these things are being driven from behind the scenes. And I'm not speaking in conspiratorially, I'm saying that there are groups like the United Nations Principle for Responsible Investment and the Task Force on Climate Change Disclosure, BlackRock, all these big companies, big pension plans. And in fact, recently, the 8 big pension giants in Canada called for a green COVID recovery. They're supposed to just invest. Why are they activists? Sorry, I have another question here. Robert Bebb is asking, what are the chances that this global warming nonsense will disappear on its own as a result of the grand solar minimum?
Well, I'm not a scientist, so but my understanding is that the grand solar minimum is going to here. It's not about to arrive tomorrow. I would have said before we experienced this year that when we experienced a real crisis, we would have no more time and energy to be dealing with what is certainly not an immediate crisis. That climate would fade into the background because we would have real problems to deal with. That apparently I was wrong about that. And there are all of these people, these green activists who are trying to ride on the coattails of COVID and talking about a green reset. I think it's all bizarre and crazy, but they're trying their best, and we'll see what we end up with. But again, the I think it's an interesting argument to say, maybe you're right, but what are you doing associating with a movement which is so anti-democratic? Why are you supporting that?
Yes, and it is interesting that, due to the requirements of the contagious nature of the COVID virus, some of the issues of lockdown and such like were implemented to try and prevent its spread. But most of the climate activist community are saying, see, we told you that you could just shut down everything and that would change the climate. And so this is proof we can do it, which even Bernard Looney of BP is saying that on the Great Reset video. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, okay, so how would your shareholders like it if we just shut down your company? So you're right, it's like so anti-democratic, and yet these things are being conflated. So let's see, I have 2 more questions here. Are you good for that?
Perfect.
Okay, so we have John, I may pronounce his name wrong, I'm sorry, uh, Kastorka, and he's saying the climate of intolerance has engulfed the whole world, going way beyond just climate change. Much of this movement appears to be very well funded to be as effective as it is. Have you any idea who's writing the checks?
Well, we know that there are some very wealthy people who are funding the climate movement. Bloomberg, Steyer.
Mhm.
We know that those people are funding it. George Soros. So um, I think we have always had to fight against intolerance. I think there are always fashionable ideas, and it's human nature to try to demonize people who disagree with you, to assume that their motives are bad rather than they simply have a different point of view. So I'm not. I think I think certainly at universities there's much more intolerance, but intolerance isn't a new thing, and so I think where we go from here is partly in our hands, and but it's also a community decision, and we have people in our community who are losing their allegiance to free speech and to democracy, and that's a big concern.
Right. Okay. And I have one here from Greg Chornaboy. He's saying, how have the courts generally been disposed to these cases? And he's thinking about the BC courts dismissing Michael Mann's lawsuit against Tim Ball, which I think I have to say was more based on the length of time that had been drawn out rather than the actual content of the case.
Yeah, I actually, I wouldn't want to comment on, generally speaking, on how lawsuits are going. Um, I think the lawsuits around Michael Mann are all quite confusing, and there's many of them, and I haven't looked at that topic in quite a while, so I wouldn't want to say much. But to go back to what I was saying earlier about there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits.
Mhm.
Go check it out, climatecasechart.com. There is, I think, 1,300 in the US, plus another 400. So we're talking about 1,700 climate lawsuits.
Wow.
That's a lot. And all they want to do is get a precedent
Yes.
somewhere. They need to win on crucial points somewhere,
Mhm.
and then their next step is to argue that that should be the precedent for the rest of us.
Yeah.
They can judge somewhere that is going to agree with them. So what's going on in the courts is really frightening, and just think about the money that is being, in my view, wasted
Yeah.
by 1,700 different lawsuits. There are a lot of really good things that could be done with that money rather than paying a bunch of lawyers to find some legal trick to take away more of our choices.
Right. That's very good. I think we're going to wrap up with the questions now. You've been very, very generous with your time, Donna, and with your excellent presentation. We do still have more questions, and we thought perhaps of like posting them on the blog, maybe getting some uh, reflections from you, but we can discuss how we actually do that. So I want to just thank you very, very much for being part of this year's 17th annual event. You were with us in 2012. I think you did the first Canadian presentation with us in 2012 when you talked about your book, The Delinquent Teenager, and that event is, of course, on our event page if people want to go back and look at it. And that was one of our more popular events. So we're very happy that you could join us again and happy that we could actually complete this in 2020, even though we'd slated it for April. So I will let you go now, Donna. Thank you so much. Hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Okay, have a good evening. And for our viewers, thank you all for sending in your positive comments and your many comments. We didn't get to them all, but we don't want to keep Donna up all night long. I did want to mention that you will be able to see the program again and the question and answer period by just re-entering your code, and you can watch the same program over and over again. Um, we will also hope that you can join us for Dr. Roy Spencer's presentation. That will be part 2 of our original 17th annual event. That will be in January, on January the 19th, 2021 at 7 p.m. And it will be a similar kind of format. So I just want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you for those who have subscribed and become a member of Friends of Science. Thank you for your support. And let's continue to get the word out, to get an open civil debate going on climate change. And I think the points that Donna made were excellent, that it's an anti-democratic movement on the other side. That's a very important thing. I've read quite a bit of history, and one of the things that struck me was a commentary by Amartya Sen, who was a UN envoy at the time, and he's an economist. And they did a big survey on democracy in the world, and they found that wherever there was a free press and freedom of speech, there was, even if there were troubles in that country, there was never famine in the country. But anywhere that there was no free speech and no freedom of the press, there was famine. And that's what happens when these democratic rights of ours are taken away or suppressed. The very serious consequences that we don't think are possible today in Canada. Just look at Venezuela and see how they slipped off that cliff in the space of a few months and now into years of chaos. So that's not a very cheery note. I'd like to say in closing that we hope that everyone has a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And thank you for joining us. We hope that 2021 will be a much better year for everyone in every way. And we hope that you'll continue stimulating the debate. And we hope you'll join us for Dr. Roy Spencer on January 19th, 2021 at 7 p.m. So thank you. And from Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Stirling, and good night.